The swamp doesn't give things back. Not boats, not names, not men. The Atchafalaya Basin, 1.4 million acres of water, mud, and patience. People go in. Some come out. Roy Deschamps, wanted for questioning in a family homicide. Last seen 12 years ago. Officially, he never left the swamp. A skull, found in a fishing net, 30 meters below the surface. DNA confirmed. Roy Deschamps. Case closed. File sealed. Detective retired. Then the DNA came back wrong. Marcus Thibodeau had 3 months until retirement. He had already picked out the porch chair. Then Dr. Patry called. Somewhere out there, something watched back. Something that had been watching for a long time. It started with a net. The way most things in this part of Louisiana start. Low, slow, and wrong. 2 commercial fishermen working the Atchafalaya Basin before the heat set in. Routine haul. Catfish, debris, the usual sediment of a river that remembers everything. What came up this time was not a catfish. Male, 40 to 50 years at time of death. Submerged approximately 10 to 14 years. The parish ran DNA through CODIS, standard procedure. The match came back in 6 hours. Roy Antoine Deschamps, deceased. Case number 04, CR 1187. Status, closed. Dr. Solange Patry read the match twice. Then she read the original case file. Then she made a phone call she didn't want to make. The problem was not the DNA match. The problem was what the DNA match meant. If this skeleton was Roy Deschamps, then the skull found 12 years ago, the skull that closed the case, the skull that retired Detective Thibodeau had signed off on, that skull belonged to someone else entirely. Someone no one had ever reported missing. Thibodeau had not reviewed the Deschamps file in 8 years. He hadn't needed to. The file was closed. He had closed it. He remembered the skull. He remembered the DNA report landing on his desk the same week his captain put him in for commendation. He remembered not asking questions. He had told himself it was because the evidence was clean. Standing here now, he understood the real reason. He hadn't wanted an answer. He had wanted a door. And someone had given him one. 3 months until retirement. He picked up the file. He didn't think about the porch chair again. The original case. Summer. 12 years back. Roy Deschamps, 36 years old, reported to the St. Mary Parish Sheriff's Department following the death of his father, Claude Deschamps, found at the bottom of a staircase in the family home on Bayou Sorrel Road. Blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. One witness, Roy's sister, Celeste. She had said it was an accident. Roy had said nothing at all, because Roy was already gone. He had left the truck running. That detail was in the file. Page 3, Officer's Notes. Roy Deschamps had left so fast he didn't kill the engine. The question no one had pressed hard enough. Was he running from what he'd done, or from what he'd seen? Thibodeau had caught the case 10 days after Roy disappeared. By then, the trail was cold and the parish was done asking questions. Claude Deschamps had not been a beloved man. The neighbors knew it. The church knew it. The sheriff's department had known it too. Some deaths in some parishes get the minimum. This had been one of those. Patry had gone further than the phone call required. The original skull, the one that closed the case, had been cremated per county protocol 18 months after sentencing. No sentencing had occurred. Roy had never been tried. The skull had simply been processed, filed, destroyed. Someone moved that file through the system very cleanly. She told Thibodeau when he arrived. She said it the way a person says something they've been waiting 12 years for someone to hear. You signed the closure report, Patry said. Not an accusation, a fact, delivered like a scalpel. I signed what the DNA said. The DNA said a name. You didn't ask where the sample came from. Silence. The fluorescent hum above them. The skeleton on the table, patient as only the dead can be. She was right. A DNA reference sample had to come from somewhere. At the time of closure, Roy had no prior arrests, no sample in the system. So where had the match come from? Thibodeau thought back. The commendation, the captain's handshake, the case that closed itself. He had been handed something. He just hadn't looked at whose hands were giving it. Celeste Deschamps had never left. She had stayed in the house where her father died and her brother disappeared in the same week. She had stayed for 12 years. Thibodeau drove out to Bayou Sorrel Road the same afternoon. He had interviewed her once back then. 20 minutes. Perfunctory. She had said, accident. He had written, accident. He knocked on the door and waited, and wondered what a woman who had been waiting 12 years would look like when someone finally came back to ask. She recognized him. Detective Thibodeau. Not a question. Ms. Deschamps, I need to talk to you about Roy. A pause long enough to contain 12 years. Then she stepped back from the door and let him in. She didn't ask why now. Maybe she already knew. Or maybe she had stopped asking why a long time ago and only kept the door unlocked. Just in case. They found remains, Thibodeau said. In the basin, DNA matched Roy. Current sample, recent find. Celeste's hands, flat on the table, did not move. But 12 years ago you told me. I know what I told you. Outside, the bayou sat in its silence. Inside, Celeste Deschamps looked at the detective across her father's kitchen table and said the 4 words she had been carrying since the night the truck engine ran until it ran out of gas. Roy didn't kill him. He had heard those words before. Not from Celeste. She had said accident, clean and flat, 12 years ago. He had heard them in the silence of the file. In the 2 clean DNA match. In the captain's handshake. In every question he had chosen not to ask. Someone had needed Roy Deschamps to be guilty. And someone had made sure that Thibodeau would agree. The question sitting across from him now, wearing 12 years of a woman's patience. Who? Tell me about that night, Thibodeau said. Not the question he had asked 12 years ago. That night he had asked, where were you when it happened? Same night. Different question. Celeste looked at the notepad, then at him. You're going to write it down this time? The notepad stayed open. The pen didn't move. Talk first, he said. I'll decide what matters. She spoke slowly, careful, like moving through water. Their father, Claude, 61. A man built from stubbornness and bourbon, who had spent 30 years making the house feel smaller than it was. Roy had come home that evening. Unusual. Roy rarely came home anymore. He and Claude had argued. Celeste had heard it from her room. She didn't know about what. Then the sound of the staircase. Then silence. Then Roy's voice calling her name. Once, low, controlled. The voice of someone who had already decided what to do next. She found her father at the bottom. She did not call for an ambulance first. She called Roy's name again. Roy was standing in the kitchen doorway. Not panicked. Not crying. Just standing there with his hands at his sides, looking at their father the way you look at something that has finally stopped moving. He fell, Roy said. And Celeste, who had grown up in this house, who knew every creak and shadow of it, looked at her brother's hands and said, okay. He fell. She said again now, 12 years later. Same words. But this time Thibodeau heard what was underneath them. Roy had not pushed their father down the stairs. Roy had found him there. Already at the bottom. Already still. And Roy had run. Not from guilt. From the knowledge of who else had a reason. A reason Celeste had spent 12 years protecting. Who else had a reason, Celeste? Not a question. A door he was opening and waiting for her to walk through. She looked at the wall, at the crooked religious print, at the school photo of Roy, 17, unsmiling, standing somewhere outside this house like he was already planning to leave it. "There's a man," she said. Was a man. He used to come by when Papa was drunk enough to do business. Thibodeau's pen found the notepad on its own. What kind of business? Celeste's eyes came back to him. The kind Papa didn't put his name on. Claude Deschamps had debts. Not the kind a bank holds. The kind the Bayou holds. For years, according to Celeste, he had allowed certain men to use the property. The access road, the dock, the water route behind the house, for transport that didn't have paperwork. He had been paid in cash and in silence. The night he died, something had changed. He had told someone no. Claude Deschamps, who had never told anyone no in his life, had picked that night to develop a principle. It had not gone well for him. Roy had known. Not just that his father was dead. He had known who had come to the house that night. He had probably seen the man leaving, so Roy had run. Not because he was guilty, but because he knew that the men who used that access road and that dock and that water route would not appreciate a witness. And someone, somewhere in the St. Mary Parish system, had been connected enough to those men to hand Marcus Thibodeau a clean DNA match and a reason to close the file. Thibodeau stood in the driveway until the last light went. He thought about the captain's handshake. He thought about the commendation plaque still bolted to the wall of his office. Somewhere in 1.4 million acres of water and patience, Roy Deschamps had been living for 12 years. Not hiding, exactly. That was the word Thibodeau had used in his head on the drive out. But Celeste had used a different word before he left. "He's not hiding," she had said, standing at the screen door, her voice dropping to the register people use when they say the thing they've rehearsed saying alone. "He built something out there. He's protecting it." Protecting it from what, she hadn't said. And Thibodeau, for the first time in 12 years, had been too unsettled to ask. He worked until 2 in the morning. By midnight, he had the shape of it. A network using the Bayou's back channels for transit, operating for at least 15 years, with connections deep enough to reach a DNA database. By one, he had a name, a man who had done business with Claude Deschamps, a man who, 12 years ago, had been a parish records clerk, who was now, Thibodeau discovered with a cold and particular dread, the deputy director of the St. Mary Parish Sheriff's Department. The pen circled the name a third time, a fourth. Then Thibodeau put the pen down, looked at the commendation plaque on the wall, and understood completely and for the first time exactly what it had cost. Deputy Director Harlan Broussard. Thibodeau had met him twice, maybe 3 times. A soft-spoken man with a careful handshake, and a talent for being in the room without being remembered. The kind of man institutions promote because he never makes anyone uncomfortable enough to look closely. 12 years ago, parish records clerk, access to filing systems, evidence tracking, DNA database entries, the exact access required to insert a reference sample under a fugitive's name and make a case close itself. Now, deputy director. The kind of promotion a favor earns, not the top. Never the top. The men at the top get investigated. The men at the top get indicted, tried, profiled. Broussard had spent 15 years finding the precise elevation at which a man becomes untouchable without becoming visible. Deputy director. High enough to bury things. Low enough to be forgiven as administrative. Thibodeau had spent 30 years in law enforcement and had never once looked at that altitude. He was looking now. He needed to move carefully. Broussard was parish. Thibodeau was state. Technically separate jurisdictions, but 15 years of network building didn't stop at county lines. If Broussard had friends in the state system, and a man at his altitude always had friends in the state system, a direct inquiry would reach him inside of an hour. Thibodeau thought about who he trusted. It was a short list. It got shorter the longer he thought about it. He called Petrie. She listened without interrupting. That was the thing about Petrie. She never performed attention. She simply gave it. completely and without warmth, like a diagnostic tool running a scan. When Thibodeau finished, she said, "The original skull sample, the one that matched Roy, I pulled the chain of custody record last night." A pause. The morgue hum behind her. "The intake signature on that sample is illegible. It's been illegible since entry. That's not deterioration. That's a decision. I need the original intake log," Thibodeau said. "I need every document that touched that sample from collection to database entry. That's a formal records request. It goes through the parish." "I know." Silence on the line. If Broussard sees a records request on the Deschamps DNA chain, he'll know someone is looking. "I know." Another silence. Longer. "Give me until this afternoon," Petrie said. She didn't explain how. She hung up. Thibodeau had worked with forensic pathologists for 30 years. He had never met one who made him feel simultaneously safer and more implicated. While Thibodeau worked the paper trail, the basin kept its own schedule, the clearing Celeste had described. Not a camp. She had been careful about that word, a clearing, with structures. With a water filtration setup and a vegetable plot, and a medical kit maintained by someone who knew what they were doing. Roy Deschamps had not been surviving in the bayou for 12 years. He had been building. The question Thibodeau kept circling. Building what, exactly, and for whom? 12 years changes a man. Roy Deschamps had gone into the bayou at 36, carrying nothing but the knowledge of what he'd seen, and the reasonable certainty that the men he'd seen had friends in places that mattered. He had expected to last a season, maybe two. What the swamp had given him instead was something he hadn't had a word for at 36, and still didn't quite have a word for now. Stillness. Not peace. He wasn't sentimental about it. Just the particular clarity of a life reduced to exactly what it needed to be. He was not alone. Had not been alone for 9 of the 12 years. The others had come in ones and twos, drawn not by advertisement, but by the bayou's own logic, the way water finds the lowest point and settles there. Each one carrying something they couldn't put down anywhere else. Each one useful. Each one, in Roy's estimation, genuinely trying. He had not asked questions about what they were running from. That had been the first rule, and it remained the only one that had never needed to be revised. He had known, eventually, that someone would come, not because he was careless, because the world outside the basin had its own logic, its own water finding its own low point. And DNA didn't stay buried forever. He knew that. He'd known it for years. What he hadn't known was whether the person coming would be someone Broussard sent, or someone Broussard hadn't gotten to yet. The distinction mattered considerably. He had a way of finding out. He had been using it all morning. Celeste had called Roy after Thibodeau left, not on a phone with a number. On a frequency Roy had set up 7 years ago, a modified radio channel, short range, used twice a month on a rotating schedule. She had told him about the bones, about the detective, about the way Thibodeau had looked at the commendation photo on his wall before he walked out. Roy had listened to all of it. Then he had said 4 words that told Celeste everything about what came next. Give him 2 days. She had found it in 4 hours, not through a formal records request that would have tripped a wire, through the morgue's own intake system, a legacy database that predated the parish's 2019 overhaul and had never been fully migrated. The original DNA reference sample for Roy Deschamps, the sample that had no business existing since Roy had no prior arrests, had been logged under a case number that corresponded to a 2003 property dispute. A property dispute that had nothing to do with Roy Deschamps, a case number that belonged to a file signed out and never returned by a parish records clerk named H. Broussard. Thibodeau read it twice. He used a property dispute case number to log a biological sample into a homicide database. 11 months before the Deschamps case was even opened, Petrie said. Thibodeau looked up. He built the exit before the fire started. Whoever told him Roy was going to become a problem told him early enough to prepare. The implication sat between them with a particular weight of things that cannot be unsaid, once said. Someone had known Claude Deschamps was going to die. Before Claude Deschamps died. Premeditation, not just the cover-up. The cover-up had been premeditated. Which meant Claude Deschamps' death had been premeditated. Which meant the men who used his access road and his dock had decided, at some point before that night, that Claude Deschamps' usefulness had an end date. And Roy had been in the house, and Roy had seen something. A face, a vehicle, a conversation that made him too dangerous to leave in place and too visible to disappear cleanly. So instead they had disappeared him on paper. A dead man couldn't testify. A dead man couldn't be found in the basin and asked what he'd witnessed. Except Roy wasn't dead. And the basin, eventually, had given something back. Harlan Broussard. Thibodeau pulled everything he could find without triggering a formal inquiry. Public record, court appearances, property holdings, a camp on the Atchafalaya. Of course, a boat registered in his wife's name. Naturally, no criminal record, not even a parking citation. The administrative cleanliness of a man who understood that the most dangerous document is the one with your name on it. And yet, underneath the surface, 3 asset transfers in 2004, the year after Claude Deschamps died, properties purchased through an LLC, whose registered agent was a cousin who had since moved to Beaumont, Texas, and whose phone, when Thibodeau called it, rang 11 times and went nowhere. He needed to go into the basin. That was the part he'd been circling for 2 days without letting himself land on it. The paper trail would take him to Broussard eventually, but eventually was not a timeline. Eventually, in a system Broussard had spent 15 years threading his own people through, could mean never. Roy Deschamps had been in that basin for 12 years. Roy Deschamps had seen a face on a night in 2003 that had made powerful men go to considerable trouble. Roy Deschamps was the only document. Broussard hadn't been able to falsify. Thibodeau drove back to Bayou Sorrel Road that evening. He didn't call ahead. Celeste had the map on the table before he knocked. She looked up when he came through the door. She'd left it unlocked, and said nothing for a moment, studying him the way her brother had trained her to study people. Not for what they said, but for what they'd already decided before they arrived. "You want to go in," she said. "I need to talk to Roy." "Those aren't the same thing in the basin." She slid the map across the table. "Sit down. This takes a while to explain." She talked for 40 minutes. The entry channels that looked navigable but weren't. The 3 landmarks: a split cypress, a rusted oil drum, a particular bend where the water changed color that marked the boundary of Roy's range, the signal. 2 short, 1 long, repeated. The correct response if Roy was watching. Silence, then movement toward the bank. The wrong response. Any other pattern. And Roy would be gone before Thibodeau's boat touched the mud. "He'll know you're coming before you're halfway in," she said. "I know. He may not come out. I know that too." Celeste folded the map and handed it to him. "He said 2 days. Today is day 2. She paused. "He's been watching you, detective, since you left here yesterday." Roy had been watching him. Not paranoia. Procedure. The same instinct Thibodeau applied to every new contact. Observe before engaging, establish intent before proximity, applied from the other side of the tree line by a man who had survived 12 years by being better at it than anyone looking for him. Thibodeau sat with that for a moment. The hunted man, running surveillance on the detective only now realizing he had been under observation since the beginning. He looked at the dark tree line. Somewhere in it, Roy Deschamps looked back. Thibodeau raised one hand, not a wave, not a signal, just an acknowledgement, and got in his car. Roy watched the headlights disappear down Bayou Sorrel Road. Then he watched the dark where they had been for a long time after, Celeste had said. He looked at the commendation on his wall. The way you look at something you're deciding whether to take down. Roy had spent 12 years reading men from a distance, reading the ones who came looking with official vehicles, and the ones who came looking without, reading the Bayou guides who occasionally brought someone in a clean jacket too far into the interior, and the ones who brought them back out quieter than they went in. He had read Thibodeau through Celeste's eyes, through the 2 days of watching, through the single raised hand just now, offered to a dark tree line, to a man who might or might not be there. Roy stood up from the bank, started back toward the clearing. Tomorrow the detective would come into the basin. Roy would let him find what Roy wanted him to find. Whether that was enough, whether Thibodeau was the kind of man who could be trusted with what Roy knew, the basin would make that determination. The basin always did. He left before first light. No radio, no GPS. The signal died 3 miles in anyway, a fact Celeste had noted on the map with a small X and the word here. No sidearm visible. He had it, but holstered under the jacket, because a man arriving in someone else's territory with his weapon displayed was communicating something he didn't intend to communicate. The basin received him the way it received everything, without comment. The split cypress, then the oil drum, then the bend where the water turned amber. Tannins from the root system, Celeste had explained. Means you're in the old growth section. Means you've gone far enough. Thibodeau stopped the boat, let it sit in the current, barely a current, more a suggestion, and did what Celeste had told him to do. 2 short knocks against the hull with the pole. 1 long, repeated, then silence, then stillness, the basin doing what the basin does. Nothing. 1 minute. 2. The water moved underneath the boat with the slow indifference of water that has been here longer than anyone watching it. Then, not a sound. A movement. On the left bank, 30 meters ahead, a cypress root shifted. Not the root, something behind it. Something that had been there long enough to become part of the bank and was only now choosing to separate itself. He didn't speak first. He stood on the root and looked at Thibodeau with the unhurried attention of a man who has already completed his assessment and is now simply allowing the other person to catch up. Thibodeau held the push-pole across his knees, kept his hands visible. The water between them, maybe 10 meters, close enough to talk, far enough that everything said would have to be chosen carefully. Roy Deschamps, Thibodeau said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a name, offered like a handshake. Roy said nothing for a moment. Then, you closed my case. I did. Wrongly. Yes. The water moved between them. A bird called somewhere deep in the canopy and went unanswered. Celeste says you looked at something on your wall, Roy said. A commendation. What did you do with it? Thibodeau reached into his jacket pocket, held up a small brass plaque, unbolted, edges still showing the wall anchor marks. He set it on the floor of the boat. Left it in the car, he said. Roy looked at the plaque, at the wall anchor marks on its edges, at what those marks meant about when it had been removed. He had expected performance. A detective arriving in the basin with reassurances, with procedural language, with the careful vocabulary of a system offering one of its own a soft landing. The plaque on the floor of the boat was not performance. You don't scar a wall for an audience that isn't there to see the wall. Roy stepped off the root into the water, knee-deep, unhesitating, and waded to the side of the boat. Roy's hands on the gunwale, Thibodeau not moving back. The man I saw that night, Roy said. I know who he is now, Thibodeau said. You found the DNA log. Petrie found it. Roy's jaw moved once, something working through him. Not surprise. 12 years had processed the surprise out of him. But the particular sensation of a fact you've been carrying alone suddenly being carried by someone else. The weight doesn't halve, but the distribution shifts. He was there when I came in that night, Roy said. His vehicle was on the access road. I came in the back way, habit, so he didn't see me see him. But I saw his face, and I saw what was in the truck. What was in the truck, Roy? Roy looked at the amber water beside the boat, had his own hands on the gunwale. At the 12 years, those hands represented the building, the protecting, the waiting for someone to come who wasn't Broussard's, People, Roy said. One word, flat as the water, heavy as the cypress roots. In the truck, on the access road, my father's access road that he'd been selling use of for years without knowing or without asking what it was being used for. Thibodeau did not write anything down. He didn't move at all. How many? He said. 4 that night, Roy said. But it wasn't the first time. I'd seen the truck on the road before. Twice, maybe 3 times. Always late. Always dark. I never looked close enough before that night. I didn't want to know. He paused. The basin breathed around them. My father knew what he was moving. He told himself he didn't, but he knew. And when he finally told them no, when whatever was left of him finally said enough, they didn't argue with him. They just finished the conversation another way. Roy let go of the gunwale, stepped back in the water, looked at Thibodeau directly. I've been keeping count, he said. 12 years of keeping count. Dates. Vehicles. Faces I've seen moving through this basin that didn't belong here. I wrote it all down. He reached into his canvas jacket and produced a waterproof pouch. Worn, repaired at the seam with electrical tape. The kind of object that has been protected above everything else for a very long time. This is what you came for, Roy said. This is what I've been waiting to give someone. He held it out across the water. Thibodeau took it. 12 years of documentation. Roy Deschamps had not simply survived in the basin. He had worked. Dates going back to 2004, his first winter in the swamp, when he had begun to understand that the access road behind his father's house was still being used, that whatever network his father had served had not paused to mourn him. Vehicle descriptions, partial plates, time windows, water routes. The pattern of movement through the basin's interior channels, the ones that didn't appear on any public map, annotated in Roy's cramped, careful hand. He watched Thibodeau read. He had written those pages in firelight and in gray winter mornings and in the dead heat of August afternoons when the basin smelled like the inside of something alive. He had written them with the understanding that they might never reach anyone. That he might die in this swamp with the pages, and the pages would rot with him, and Broussard would retire on a pension, and the access road would keep serving its purpose until someone else eventually noticed. He had written them anyway, because the alternative, knowing what he knew and leaving no record of it, was a kind of second death he hadn't been willing to accept. Broussard's name appeared 11 times, not always as a driver, sometimes as a contact, a meeting point, a handoff, once in 2009 as a witness to a transaction. Roy had observed from 40 meters through a gap in the cypress wall. Roy had been close enough to hear voices, not words. Voices. And he had described what he saw with the precision of a man who understood that imprecision was the thing that let men like Broussard walk away from courtrooms. Every entry was dated. Every entry was cross-referenced. 11 years of a case file built by a man the system believed was dead. Thibodeau looked up from the pages. "This is enough," he said. "Not a reassurance. A professional assessment." The voice of a man who had built cases for 30 years recognizing the architecture of one. Roy said nothing. "This is more than enough, Roy." The partial plates alone. 3 of them are on record with a federal trafficking task force that's been running a parallel investigation out of New Orleans for 4 years. Something moved through Roy's face. Not relief. Too complicated for relief. The expression of a man who has run a very long race and has just been told he is approaching something that might be a finish line, but might also be another kind of beginning. A federal task force changed the geometry entirely. It meant Thibodeau didn't have to move through the state system. The system Broussard had 15 years of thread running through. It meant a lateral approach. It meant the documents in this pouch could arrive at a desk in New Orleans without passing through a single office that Broussard had ever signed his name in. It also meant something else, something Thibodeau had not yet said out loud, but that Roy, watching him from the bank with 12 years of reading men from a distance, had already understood. "You need me to come in," Roy said. "Not a question. The documents are evidence. Your testimony is the case." Roy looked at the water, at the tree line behind Thibodeau's boat, at the invisible direction of Celeste's house, somewhere beyond the trees and the road. "I have people here," he said. "In the clearing." "I know. They came to me because they had nowhere else." "I know that too. If I come in, if I walk out of this basin, what happens to them?" Thibodeau was quiet for a moment. The honest kind of quiet, not preparation, consideration. "I can't promise anything about the others until I know who they are and what they're carrying. You know that. You know I'd be lying if I said otherwise." Roy nodded once. He had expected honesty. He had been prepared for reassurance, and had known reassurance would be the wrong answer. "What I can tell you," Thibodeau continued, "is that a federal task force is not a St. Mary Parish sheriff's deputy with Broussard's number in his phone. The jurisdictional wall is real, and I will walk into that wall first. I will put my name on every document and my face in front of every camera before anything you've built here becomes a casualty of this. 12 years. 12 years of mornings where the first sound was water, and the first decision was whether today was the day to stop waiting. Roy had stayed because leaving felt like surrender, and staying felt like witness. Like being the last person in the room who remembered what actually happened and refusing to walk out until someone else entered to receive that memory. Thibodeau had entered. Thibodeau had unbolted a plaque from a wall in a building 30 miles away and carried the evidence of that decision into the basin in his jacket pocket. It wasn't absolution. Roy wasn't looking for absolution. He was looking for a transfer of custody, of the knowledge, of the record, of the 12 years of careful witness to someone with the standing to act on it. "I need 3 days," Roy said, "to talk to the people in the clearing, to give them the choice properly. Not my decision. Theirs." Thibodeau nodded. 3 days. He pushed off and let the current take the bow back toward the entry channel. Behind him, Roy stood at the waterline and watched the boat diminish. Thibodeau did not look back. Looking back felt wrong, like checking whether a man you just trusted was going to do what he said. Roy Deschamps had spent 12 years being exactly what he said he was. The least Thibodeau could do was extend the same in the opposite direction. He pushed through the amber section, past the oil drum, past the split cypress, back toward the world with roads and signals, and a deputy director named Broussard who did not yet know the basin had spoken. 3 days. Thibodeau had work to do. Roy stood at the water's edge until the wake was gone. Then he turned back toward the clearing, toward the people who had come to him in ones and twos over 9 years, each one carrying something they couldn't put down anywhere else. He had never asked what they carried. First rule. Only rule that never needed revision. Now he would have to ask. Not for himself, for them, so that each one could make their own calculation about what the world outside the basin was worth walking back into. He moved through the trees. The bayou closed behind him like water, like it had never opened at all. He worked through the night again, not transcribing, translating. Roy's documentation was precise but personal, built from 12 years of solitary observation in a language shaped by isolation. Thibodeau's job was to render it into the vocabulary of federal evidence: chain of custody, witness provenance, corroborating record, admissibility. By 3 in the morning, he had the shape of a package, the kind you bring to a federal prosecutor, not as a request but as a completed argument. The kind that removes the question of whether to proceed and replaces it with the question of how fast. He had one contact in the federal system who had not passed through any Louisiana Parish office: Diane Voss, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Eastern District. He had worked a peripheral case with her 7 years back, a money laundering thread that had briefly crossed into state jurisdiction before returning to federal. She had been precise, difficult, and correct about everything. The kind of person you save, for when correct is the only thing that matters. He would call her at 8. He would use his personal phone. He would make the call from his car, parked somewhere that was not his office and was not his home. Thibodeau had spent 30 years trusting institutions. He was done with that particular habit. Petrie had completed her forensic report. The new remains, Roy Deschamps, confirmed. Submerged 10 to 14 years after death, which put the time of death between 2010 and 2014, well into Roy's time in the basin. Not Roy then. Someone else who had died out there in the years after Roy disappeared. Someone whose remains had eventually found their way into a fishing net with a DNA profile that matched a reference sample fabricated by a parish records clerk 2 decades prior. The question Petrie had been turning over since midnight: who had the original skull belonged to, and why had their DNA been close enough to Roy's to survive the match? She had pulled the familial DNA literature at 2 in the morning. Standard forensic methodology. If a reference sample doesn't match the subject precisely, but matches closely enough to trigger a hit, it suggests a biological relative. The fabricated Roy Deschamps sample had been close enough to trigger a match on remains that shared roughly 40% of his markers. 40% parent, sibling. Child. Roy had no children on record. His mother had died in 1998. Claude Deschamps had been cremated, no DNA on file, per the same county protocol that had destroyed the original skull, which left one possibility. One that the file had never mentioned, because no one had ever asked. Petrie called Thibodeau at 7:45. Thibodeau called Celeste at 8. The question he asked was not the question Celeste had been expecting. Did Roy have a brother? The silence on the line lasted long enough that Thibodeau thought the call had dropped. Then Celeste said, "How did you find out?" "Not. There was no brother?" "Not. What are you talking about? How did you find out?" "His name was Theodore." Younger than Roy by 4 years. He had left the basin before Roy arrived. Gone to Lafayette, then to New Orleans, then to a life that Celeste had followed. At the distance, their father's gravity had imposed on all of them. He had come back once. In 2011, he had come back because he'd heard through the channels that information travels in a family without a center, that Roy was somewhere in the basin. He had come back to find Roy. He had not come back out. Theodore Deschamps disappeared 2011. Never reported missing. Celeste had assumed he'd gone back to New Orleans. Broussard's network had been active in the basin that year. Roy's documentation confirmed 3 transit events in the spring of 2011. Thibodeau pulled up Roy's pages in his mind. One entry from April 2011, an event Roy had described with less precision than the others, the handwriting slightly different, the margins empty where they were usually dense with cross-references. An entry that described a vehicle on the access road, and then stopped mid-sentence. A page that had been folded separately from the rest and placed at the back of the pouch. Roy knew. Roy had been in the basin when his brother came looking for him, and Roy had been in the basin when his brother didn't come back out. The remains in the fishing net. Theodore Deschamps. He had come into the basin in the spring of 2011 looking for his brother. He had encountered Broussard's network instead. The wrong vehicle, the wrong channel, the wrong night. And the network had handled it. The way the network handled complications. Cleanly and without paperwork. Roy had found out. Roy had written it down with the handwriting of a man who could barely hold the pen. And then Roy had folded that page separately and placed it at the back of the pouch and had kept building his documentation, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping meant Theodore's death meant nothing to anyone but the water. 3 days. Roy had asked for 3 days to talk to the people in the clearing. Thibodeau sat on the levee and looked at the water and thought about what Roy was actually carrying. Not just the documentation, not just 12 years of witness. His brother, The knowledge of his brother's death. The knowledge of where his brother's remains had gone and how they got there, and who had been standing on an access road when it happened. Roy had handed Thibodeau the pouch without mentioning Theodore. He had handed over 11 years of documented evidence and kept the most personal piece of it folded at the back, not because he was hiding it. Because some things you carry yourself until someone is ready to help you set them down. Thibodeau dialed Diane Voss. Diane Voss answered on the second ring. Thibodeau talked for 11 minutes without interruption. He laid it in order: the fishing net, the DNA discrepancy, Patri's chain of custody finding, Broussard's name and Roy's documentation 11 times, Theodore Deschamps, the Federal Trafficking Task Force, whose partial plates matched 3 of Roy's vehicle records. When he finished, Voss was quiet for 4 seconds. He counted. "You're calling me on a personal cell," she said. "Yes. From somewhere that isn't your office." "A levee road outside Melville." Another 2 seconds. "Don't move the documents. Don't copy them. Don't tell anyone else what you have. I'll be in Baton Rouge by 4 o'clock. The documents sat in the pouch on the corner of the desk. 12 years of observation, 11 Broussard entries, the partial plates, the April 2011 page, folded separately, placed at the back. A case file built by a dead man in a place the law had never thought to look. Thibodeau had locked the office before he left for the levee. He had also, for the first time in 30 years of leaving offices unlocked, taken the key. Broussard had a source in the state police evidence tracking system. Not a mole, nothing so dramatic. A clerk who owed him a favor, and had owed him a favor for 9 years, and had stopped thinking of it as a favor, and had started thinking of it as an arrangement. The arrangement had flagged something that morning. A cold case file signed out 2 days ago under Detective Marcus Thibodeau's credentials. Case number 04-CR1187. Broussard looked at the notification on his phone. He unfolded his hands. He picked up a different phone, not the desk phone, a personal cell kept in his jacket pocket, and made a call that lasted 45 seconds. Then he replaced the phone, refolded his hands, resumed the expression of a man conducting a routine morning. She read for 22 minutes. Thibodeau drank 2 coffees. The diner around them was half empty. A Tuesday afternoon in a town between towns, the kind of place no one chose deliberately. Voss finished the last page, set it down with the precision of someone who treats documents as the objects they legally are. "The task force has been working this network for 4 years, she said. They have financial records, 2 informants, and 1 partial plate that has never resolved." She tapped a page near the middle of Roy's stack. "Roy Deschamps has the full plate, and 9 others." Thibodeau said nothing. Let the arithmetic speak. Roy Deschamps needs to come in under federal protection, not state, not parish, federal. The moment he surfaces through any Louisiana state channel, Broussard will know within the hour. "Roy knows that," Thibodeau said. "He has 2 more days in the basin. He's talking to the people he's been sheltering." Voss was quiet for a moment. "How many people?" "I don't know exactly." Celeste said 1s and 2s over 9 years, each one potentially carrying their own legal exposure. "Yes." Voss looked at the documents again. Then, at the window. At the bar, shadows crossing the table. "Tell Roy that anyone who walks out of that basin with him walks out under the same federal umbrella. We assess exposure individually, case by case. No one gets processed through a parish office. No one talks to Broussard's jurisdiction. That's my word. Get it to him." He drove to Bayou Sorrel Road before dark. Celeste listened to Voss's terms the way she had listened to everything in this story. Quietly, completely, without the performance of reaction. When Thibodeau finished, she was still for a long moment. Then she stood up, went to the kitchen counter, and picked up the radio handset Roy had installed in the cabinet above the refrigerator. A detail she had never mentioned. A detail that had been there every time Thibodeau had sat at this table. She transmitted the signal, waited. Roy's acknowledgement came back in under a minute. 2 short, 1 long. "He heard you," Celeste said. She put the handset back, sat down, looked at Thibodeau across the table with the exhausted relief of a woman who has been the only wire connecting 2 worlds for longer than anyone asked her to be. She sat in the kitchen for a long time after he left. She thought about Theodore, about the fact that his remains had been found, and that she now knew what had happened to him, and that knowing was not the same as better, but was at least the same as real. She thought about Roy in the clearing, talking to people whose names she didn't know, about a world they had all left, and what it might mean to step back into it. She thought about the radio handset in the cabinet, about the 12 years of twice-monthly contact. Always brief, always coded, always enough to know he was alive and to transmit that knowledge back to her own body, like a signal that kept something in her from going dark. She looked at the school photograph, both of them, young, before the house had finished its work on them. She reached up and straightened the crooked religious print. It had been crooked for 12 years. She had never straightened it. She straightened it now. His source had called again at 5. Marcus Thibodeau had met with an unidentified woman at a diner in Melville for approximately 20 minutes. The woman had arrived in a rental car. Federal plates. Broussard sat with that information. Federal. 15 years of careful elevation. 15 years of staying at the precise altitude where state investigations reached their ceiling. Federal did not have a ceiling. Federal came from a different direction entirely. And the only thing that could have brought Federal to a diner in Melville with Marcus Thibodeau was something that had come out of the basin. He dialed a number he had not dialed in 3 years, a number he had hoped to never dial again. It rang once. "We have a problem," Broussard said. In the clearing, Roy had called everyone together. He told them what he knew. Not everything. The parts that were his to tell. The detective. The federal attorney. The terms. The umbrella. He told them it was a choice. Not his choice. Theirs. Anyone who wanted to stay had the right to stay. Anyone who wanted to walk out had his word that he would walk out first and stand between them and whatever came next for as long as standing was an option. He did not tell them about Theodore. That was not theirs to carry. The fire held its small territory against the dark. The basin listened without opinion. One by one, the people in the clearing gave their answer. 2 days. 1 day now. The basin, for the first time in 12 years, was counting down, instead of simply enduring. Day 3. The basin woke the same way it always woke, without announcement, without ceremony, the light arriving the way water arrives, finding every low place and filling it. Thibodeau was on the Levee Road before sunrise. Voss had driven back from New Orleans overnight. 2 federal vehicles, unmarked, parked on the gravel shoulder above the water. No sirens. No radios. The particular quiet of people who understand that what they are doing requires silence to work. Voss had 2 agents in the vehicles. She had not brought more. Thibodeau had asked her not to. A convoy arriving at the basin's edge would reach Broussard's source before the boats touched the water. "If Roy doesn't come out," Voss said, "he'll come out. You've known him for 1 conversation in a swamp. I've known what he built for 12 years. A man who builds what he built doesn't do it to stay hidden. He does it to have something worth coming out for." Voss looked at him. "That's not evidence, Thibodeau." "No," he said. "It's not." Celeste had not slept. She had made coffee at 4 in the morning and taken it to the porch and sat in the chair that had been there since her father bought it, and that she had never replaced because replacing it would have meant deciding something she wasn't ready to decide. She looked at the tree line. Somewhere beyond it, Roy was either coming or he wasn't. She had done her part. The radio, the map, the 12 years of twice-monthly signal that had kept him real to her and her real to him. The rest was his. It had always been his. He had told the people in the clearing at first light. 4 had chosen to come. 2 had chosen to stay. Roy had honored both answers equally and had not tried to change either. The 4 who were coming were behind him now, single file through the shallows, each carrying what they had built here in whatever internal architecture 12 years of living outside the world had given them for carrying things. Roy walked at the front, the April 2011 page in his hand. Theodore's page. He had decided sometime in the night that he was not going to arrive at the world's edge carrying his brother's death alone. Not anymore. Not now that there was someone on the other side who had come far enough into the water to meet him. He stood at the channel's edge, the gap in the tree line. Beyond it, the levee road. Beyond that, everything. 12 years ago, he had run into this basin with a truck engine still running behind him, and the reasonable certainty that the world outside had been arranged against him. The world outside had been arranged against him. That part had been correct. What he hadn't known, what 12 years of stillness had slowly, reluctantly clarified, was that arranged against is not the same as permanently against. That arrangements, like everything else, could be disassembled if you documented them carefully enough and waited long enough for someone with the right tools to come far enough in to receive what you'd built. He looked back once, at the basin, at the amber water and the cypress walls and the Spanish moss and the absolute silence of a place that had held him without judgment for 12 years. He did not say anything to it. It had not asked for anything. It had simply been what it was, and that had been enough. He walked through the gap. Thibodeau watched them come up the bank. 5 figures, Roy at the front, the others behind him. A woman in her 40s, 2 men, a younger person whose age was difficult to read under the bayou's 12 years of weather. Roy reached the gravel and stopped. Thibodeau took 3 steps forward. They stood 4 feet apart on a levee road above the Atchafalaya Basin in the first full light of a Louisiana morning and looked at each other the way 2 people look when they have already said everything necessary, and what remains is only the physical confirmation of what was agreed to in the water. Roy held out the April 2011 page. "My brother," he said. "Theodore. He came looking for me. He didn't find me. He found them instead." Thibodeau took the page. He did not look at it. He looked at Roy. "I know," he said. Petrie identified the remains. Something in Roy's face. The weight of the page transferred. His source had called at 6:15. Federal vehicles on the levee road above the basin entry. Thibodeau present. Unidentified individuals emerging from the water. Broussard had been driving for 20 minutes before he understood fully what he was driving toward, and why arriving would make no difference. Whatever had come out of that basin was already in federal hands. Whatever Roy Deschamps had been holding for 12 years was already on its way to a desk in New Orleans that Broussard had never been able to reach. He drove anyway, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping meant deciding something he wasn't ready to decide. Some men keep moving because moving feels like options. The levee road was 4 miles ahead. Roy looked at the tree line for a long time. Thibodeau waited. "The 2 who stayed," Roy said finally. "They know how to take care of themselves. I'll make sure no one goes looking." "You can do that?" Thibodeau thought about it honestly. "I can make it difficult to find a reason to look. That's not the same as guaranteeing it. But difficult is what I have." Roy nodded. Difficult was a currency he understood. He had been living on difficult for 12 years. He got in the vehicle. Thibodeau got in beside him. The door closed. The vehicle slowed as it passed the house. Celeste did not stand. She raised one hand from the coffee cup, a small gesture. Barely a movement. Through the window glass, a face. Roy, 12 years older. 12 years of basin weather, written across the same bone structure as the boy in the school photograph on the kitchen wall. He raised his hand. The vehicle continued down Bayou Sorel Road and did not stop. There would be time for stopping later. There would be rooms and questions and procedures, and the long machinery of justice, grinding through what Roy had built for it. But first, a hand raised from a car window. A hand raised from a porch chair. Two people confirming across 20 meters of Louisiana morning that the other one was real. The vehicle turned at the end of the road and was gone. Thibodeau watched the landscape in the window. Broussard would be processed by the federal task force within 72 hours of Roy's testimony. The network would take longer, months, maybe a year. The men who had used Claude Deschamps' access road would be found in the financial records that Roy's documentation would unlock. Thibodeau knew all of this. The way you know the outcome of a process you've set in motion, with confidence and without comfort. Justice is not the same as repair. He had known that for 30 years and had spent 30 years finding ways not to sit with it directly. He was sitting with it now. Roy's brother was dead. 12 years were gone. The two people in the clearing who had chosen to stay were still there, in the basin, beyond reach of this. He looked at his own reflection in the window, the landscape passing through it. 3 months until retirement. The porch chair still waiting. He didn't think about the porch chair. The basin remained. It did not mark the departure. It did not note the absence of the man who had lived inside it for 12 years and documented its darkest traffic in a waterproof pouch by firelight. The water moved the way water moves. The cypress roots held the bank the way they always held it. The Spanish moss turned in the faint morning air without purpose or direction. Somewhere in the interior, two people went about the business of their chosen lives in the company of the basin's absolute indifference. And on the bank near the entry channel, Roy Deschamps' boat sat in the mud where he had left it, tied to a root. Still tied. The knot, a good one. The kind that holds against current. The kind you tie when you're not sure how long you'll be gone. But you're not ready to say never.